One of the most important prophecies that we can find in the Bible is hidden in the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 7, 8, 9 up until 12. We will find events that took place. We'll find historical events that was prophecy at the time when Daniel saw these visions. We will find the fulfillment of this prophecy and of these visions coming through and are still yet to unfold. That is just how amazing these visions and dreams were that Daniel saw. And it also just shows us how important it is for God to show us the things that has happened, the things that are happening, and the things that will happen in time to come. Let's look at the prophecies in the book of Daniel chapter 7 and hopefully make some sense of them. I know a lot of prophecy students enjoy discussing these prophecies and these dreams, and there is a lot that needs to be interpreted. There's quite a lot that needs interpretation, and it needs proper interpretation, biblical interpretation. And the rules of interpretation are pretty straightforward. We do not leave anything to our imagination. We do not interpret things based on what we think we know or assumption. We go according to a few rules that are set in place for interpretation. Basically, you will find that the interpretation of a vision or symbol was already being spoken of in the Bible. You will either find the interpretation in the next passage, the next text, or the next scripture. You will find somebody will come and reveal this to the prophets, reveal their dream to them at a later stage. Or you will find, if it's not in the same passage, same chapter, same book, it will be somewhere in the Bible. Somewhere in the Bible, somebody has already seen the symbol and it has been interpreted, and that is why we do not leave it up to our imagination. That's when we get into trouble. So trust that all the interpretations that we will see is in the book, is in the Bible already, has been interpreted already. So let's continue. So we consider now that the ages of long ago and the things to come are being tackled in chapter 7. We have to look at that this is the prophetic chapter for the Gentile ages. Gentile ages means everyone else beside Israel. Okay, Israel is the chosen nation, as you know by now, and every other nation, when the Bible refers to nations or when somebody speaks about nations, it just basically means the rest of the world. All the other nations that are not, or all the other people that's not Jewish. Okay, so chapter 7 basically just continues from chapter 2, where we've learned about King Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. Remember, he dreamt about the statue, which had different types of metal. It was made of different types of metal. It started with the head of gold. The breast was silver, and then moving down to the stomach area was bronze, and then going down the feet was iron and clay. We managed to interpret that quickly, but let's just take a deeper look at what Daniel saw. And these, the visions that Daniel begins to see here, basically just speaks about the nature of the four nations. Remember, we said the head of gold was Babylon at the time. We looked at the head of silver, that was the Medo-Persians that took over. We also learned in later chapters that Darius and Cyrus, the Mede and the Persian kings, came and conquered Babylon. And then we're going to look at Greece came in. Greece took over then, and Greece began to rule and reign the world, and that would be under the reign of Antiochus the Fourth. And then we begin to look at the fourth kingdom. So the fourth kingdom is what I think Daniel in chapter 7 is more interested in. He asks a lot of questions when it comes to the fourth kingdom or the fourth beast. You'll find that chapter 7 speaks about the four beasts that most scholars know about, most scholars love quoting. These are interesting beasts, interesting looking beasts, and hence the word beast. And so we look at what Daniel saw. Let's look at what Daniel saw in verse 4. 7 verse 4. He says, the first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until the wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a man, and the heart of a man was given to it. So when we look at that one, similar to the statue, if we try and sort of make parallels with what we saw in the statue. So the lion obviously speaks of the head that was the head of gold on the statue. So now we see the lion comes, and the lion speaks to us about this, the first beast speaks to us about this lion that had 4 wings of an eagle. Okay, it speaks to us describing the lion with 4 wings, and later on we see that the wings were torn apart, or it was plucked off, and then once those wings were torn apart, it stood up and on 2 feet like a man, and it had the heart of a man, which clearly describes Babylon, and it clearly describes King Nebuchadnezzar's reign. If you understand, the symbols of Babylon was a lion, and these lions had eagle's wings. If you have a picture of that in your head, you can understand that is what's being described here. All their statues and their symbols at the time was that of lions with wings. Nebuchadnezzar matches this beast in the fact that his kingdom, if you remember, was taken from him, which speaks of the 4 wings that is being plucked from him. There was that 7-year period when he went totally mentally insane, where he had the mind of a beast. He stood up, and he on 2 feet, which means he then, after his wings was plucked, after the 7-year punishment, you will find that he began to stood up like a man. He became a man, and he had the heart of the man. Okay, so after he repented, that was when, we would say he was the first Gentile king that received salvation from God. The second beast that he saw looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, so it was lopsided. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, get up and eat your fill of flesh. This is the bear that represents Medo-Persia. The Medo-Persian reign took over from Babylon. Okay, and if you look at a bear was the second most fierce animal, or is the second most feared animal in the kingdom. Right now, it overpowers its prey by might and by strength. And that is how it basically describes the Medo-Persian reign, or the Medo-Persian kings, and how they defeated their enemies. Looking at the description of the bear, we will find that Daniel sees this bear standing lopsided, which means those 2 kingdoms that came together, even though they worked in unison, the Persians were more powerful than the Medes. So it just means that when it says he devoured much, they just devoured everyone and conquered everyone that came into their path, so that they could eventually come to Babylon and overpower Babylon. Okay, the 3 ribs basically just means that in their path of conquering cities and states, they managed to conquer Babylon, which was quite a big and powerful empire. They managed to conquer a place called Lydian, and they managed to conquer Egypt. And that is what the 3 ribs represented. When we look at the third beast that he saw, he said, when I saw another one that looked like a leopard. And on his back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. Okay, that's basically all that he gives us there. This one speaks of the Greece invasion. Greece at that time, after the Medo-Persian rule and reign, Greece then came into power. Greece then took over the world, and Greece reigned with its 4 heads and its 4 wings. The 4 heads and 4 wings just speaks about Alexander the Great, who ruled and reigned and who conquered the world at that time. In 3 years' time, he actually conquered Greece, Africa, and Egypt. If we know history, we'll understand that he had no heirs at the time when he died, and so his empire was divided into 4 different generals and 4 different geographical regions, which was east, north, west, and south. All right, and that basically just speaks about the 4 heads and the 4 wings of birds that we see there. So if we look at all this, it just traces back to history. If you understand your history and you understand when these kings came into reign and came into power, Daniel's prophecy, Daniel's dream makes perfect sense to us. Okay, everything just matches our history perfectly. Clearly this doesn't concern us, but it's good to know. We are more interested in the 4th beast. The 4th beast is where we are, and if we look at Daniel 7 verse 7, it says, "After that in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening. And it was very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns." Verse 8 says, "While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth that spoke boastfully." So now we begin to look at the 4th kingdom in a little bit more detail. Daniel has seen this vision, and if we go over from verse 15 onwards, the interpretation is there. An angel interpreted his dreams to him to explain to him, but he was more concerned about this 4th beast, because there he says this was very terrifying. It was a dreadful and terrifying beast. It was very strong. It had iron teeth, and it had 10 horns. Okay, which obviously when we look at the number 10, we've heard that previously in Daniel's book, and this just speaks of the 10 toes that we looked at when we studied the statue. So the statue, at the end of the statue, which means we are coming to the end of this age, the Gentile age, we realized and we studied that there was 10 toes at the bottom, which means the 2 legs then eventually split into 10. And then we see those 10 horns now just represent, so it's just parallel to the 10 toes on the statues. But something weird then happens that Daniel was so interested about, and he says that on the 10th horn, 11th one appeared on this beast, and this horn was very unique. All right. Okay, so studying the book of Daniel, you will find that Daniel is a prelude of the book of Revelation. You cannot study the 2 separately. It should be studied as one book. Daniel saw visions that will be revealed in the book of Revelation, which is obviously our future as the Gentile nation, and therefore it is important to understand what these visions mean in chapter 7 for you to have better clarity when it gets to the book of Revelation. So if you read, if you continue to read what Daniel saw after he said that, continues to say in verse 9 that, "As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, the hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him, and the court was seated, and the books were open." So this, obviously, if you've read the book of Revelation, this should sort of ring a bell to you. Okay, he saw a vision that sort of describes basically what we see in chapter 9. If you go to chapter 1 of the book of Revelation and verse 13, it says, "Among the lampstands was someone like the Son of Man, dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, with a golden sash around his chest. His head was white, his hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire." You can see the similarities there. Obviously, it's 2 different people, 2 different heavenly bodies that he sees. The one is God and the one is the Son of God. But you can get that what he's trying to describe here is something that's taking place in heaven. Okay. Then he continues and he tries to understand what this small horn basically represents. Okay, so if we go to verse 15, you will find then that the interpretation of the dream is being discussed here. All right, so Daniel was troubled in the spirit, he says, and the vision that passed through my mind disturbed me. I approached one of those standing there and I asked him the true meaning of this. So we went to one of the angels that was there, and we find that this is very contradictory, or just if you look at this now, the interpreter of dreams now needs an interpretation. He's very troubled, and you will find that he saw this vision, and now he's looking for somebody to help him interpret it, because clearly he couldn't do it by himself. He understood what the first three beasts meant, because obviously he understood the visions of the statue, but I think it's just the fourth one that's getting a little bit more complicated, seeing that there's 10 horns now and 11th horn popping up. Okay, so I wanted to know the true meaning of the fourth beast, he says in verse 19, which was different from, the fourth beast, which was different from the others, but it was most terrifying, and it had iron teeth and claws. Okay. He continues to say in verse 21, as I watched, the horn was waging war against the saints and defeating them until the Ancient of Days, which he refers to God. We've heard that before, and you'll understand that if you read the book and study the book of Revelation. Ancient of Days basically just refers to God. He came and he pronounced judgment in favor of the saints, the Most High, in the time. So Daniel says this: while he was in the throne room, the Ancient of Days was seated on his throne, and we will find that the books were opened. These books basically just refers to the books of the law, and so judgment needs to take place, and all the sins of the world will now be judged according to the book of the law. So we go to verse 23 now, where the angel interprets the dreams to Daniel. All right, and he says to him in 23, this is the explanation. He says the fourth beast is a fourth kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms, and it will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. So in the fourth kingdom, there will be 10 different kingdoms coming up at the same time, right? It will not be different 10 successive kings like we've seen in the previous, in the vision before, where we had our different kingdoms reigning. These 10 different kings will all come up from this fourth kingdom, from this fourth beast. There will be 10 different kingdoms that will come up, different from the earlier ones, which already explains. We're not going to look for the same pattern now. We're looking for something different, and he will subdue 3 kings, which means the 11th king will come into power, get rid of 3 kings, and there'll only remain 7. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his saints and try to change the set times and laws. So he's going to come up, he's going to blaspheme against God. You will have these ugly words and ugly things to say about the Most High, speak against him, and then he will oppress the saints, which will be the saints that will be alive at that time, and then he will try and change the set times and laws. So basically all the laws will be changed based on the book, based on the Bible. Right, he will come in with new laws, obviously bring about his own religion or whatever it is that he'll do, and then he will also try and change the times, which I think most students so far has come to the conclusion that the calendar will probably be changed around to suit whatever it is that it needs to fit the purpose at that time, right? So the court will sit, and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. So he will rule and reign for a certain time period, but then obviously his power will be taken away from him, and then heaven will be handed over to the saints, the people of the Most High. The kingdom will be everlasting kingdom, and all the rulers will worship and obey him. All the rulers will worship and obey God. Okay, so At this point in time where we are in this timeline, okay, the beast, not really a timeline, but it's just the different natures of the kingdoms. We will find that now we have to wait for these 10 kings to come into power. We don't have 10 kings ruling. We have a good couple of hundred leaders, ruling right now. Countries, each leader has, his own rule and reign and does whatever he wants to, but we do not have 10 specific kings or world leaders that has the power to rule or reign their own kingdom. So just backing up to verse 25, at the end of verse 25, it says there that the saints will be handed over to him for time, times, and half a times. So I think that is also one of the famous time, times, and half a times prophecy or piece of information that every prophetic or prophecy student enjoys talking about. We've come to the conclusion though that time, times, time and a half, and this is also more explained and talked about in the book of Revelation. Time and a half, time is 1, and then we have times which equals to 2, and then we have a half a time, which is 0.5, and if you add it up, it just it adds to 3.5, which we'll speak about it in more details when we get to chapter 9, where we get more revelation on it and more interpretation on what time, times, and half a time means. Basically just means 3.5 years. So this means that the saints will be handed over to him for a time, times, and half a times. Saints will be handed over to him, the little horn, for 3.5 years. So for 3.5 years he will rule and he will reign the earth. He will be above these 10 kingdoms that will come into rule. They will give him their power, and then he will rule and reign, taking out 3 of the kingdoms, which we'll discuss further either in the book of Revelation or chapter 9. We'll see how it goes, which basically just refers to when this little it just speaks about when this little horn comes into power. I think 3 of the kingdoms will probably just try and stand up against him, but that you will find that he will make an example, take them out, humble them, probably just destroy them, take their kingdoms by force, and then obviously there will only be 7 remaining kingdoms that will stand. So when we understand when this is said, if we look at the timeline, and we'll discuss it obviously in more detail, that he will rule and reign in the second half of the 7-year tribulation. We understand that there's a 7-year tribulation that will take place after the rapture of the church. So for the first 3.5 years, we'll look at that in Daniel chapter 9. Also the book of Revelation explains what happens there, and then the last 3.5 years is when this will take place. So by then, and by the grace of God, we will not be here. You should not want to be present when this happens, because the world will be in chaos and there will be a whole lot of catastrophic events that will take place. We understand from his description and from what he does, he is the beast, he is the 11th horn. Paul calls him the son of destruction in his books. Paul calls him the man of lawlessness in 2 Thessalonians 4. John labels him as the man of perdition. And then the most famous one that we all know is he is the Antichrist. All right, so we've come to the understanding that Daniel 2 and 7, when we look at the 10 toes, refers to the 10 horns, okay, which is a confederacy of 10 kings that will rule at the same time. So even though Jesus spoke to us in Matthew 24, and he said to us that nobody knows the time and nobody knows when, when will the coming of Christ's return will be, he's referring to He's referring to his second coming. We don't know when he will come for his bride, which will be his church, which will be the saints. That's the rapture. We don't have a time set for that yet. Only God alone knows when that will happen. But once that happens, then the clock is ticking. Then we're on the clock, and we will have to wait for that 7 years tribulation to take place until the coming of the rule and reign of the millennium kingdom. And that was chapter 7 in a nutshell.